For decades, the little white house at the end of the cul-de-sac had stood as more than just a building. It was a home, filled with memories of birthdays, holidays, and long summer evenings on the porch. The homeowner, an elderly woman in her 70s, had lived there nearly her entire adult life. Her roses bloomed faithfully each spring, and her rocking chair remained a fixture on the front steps. But to the HOA board, the house was nothing more than a nuisance. In their eyes, it was outdated, out of style, and, most importantly, sitting on prime land that could be turned into something useful. They had grown increasingly vocal about the property, insisting it lowered the value of the neighborhood and hindered their grand plans. What they envisioned was a sleek new parking lot for the clubhouse and pool, and her home stood directly in their way. The warnings began subtly, with letters citing imaginary violations, a fence that was too faded, a porch swing too old, and shrubs improperly maintained. Each letter came with an undertone of menace, as if daring her to resist. But she was a quiet, kind woman who believed reason would eventually prevail. She paid her dues, maintained her property as best she could, and trusted that the community she had been part of for decades would never truly harm her. That trust was shattered in a single day. Without proper notice, without a court order, and without the legal authority to do so, the HOA arranged for contractors to move in. By the time the sun had risen high in the sky, the sound of machinery filled the air. Neighbors peeked through blinds and stood at their driveways in shock as bulldozers tore into walls of her home. Decades of history crumbled in a matter of hours, reduced to rubble and dust. The elderly woman stood in the street, tears streaking her face, clutching the deed to her home that she had kept safe for years. Her son, a man who had grown up in that house, arrived to see nothing left but splintered wood and shattered glass. His mother's life had been uprooted, her security destroyed, and her dignity trampled on, all under the guise of community improvement. But the HOA had made a critical mistake. What they didn't realize was that her son wasn't just another powerless resident. He was a lawyer, well-versed in property law, with a reputation for dismantling cases built on arrogance and negligence. As he looked at the ruins of his mother's home, he didn't just see destruction, he saw evidence. Every brick, every piece of debris, and every tear in his mother's eyes became fuel for a storm they had unknowingly unleashed. The HOA believed they could act with impunity, bulldozing their way through sentiment, legality, and decency. But what awaited them wasn't compliance or silence. It was a reckoning that would come far sooner than they could have imagined. The very next morning, there would no longer be smug decision-makers presiding over a neighborhood. They would be defendants, walking into a courtroom they never expected to face. The rubble remained piled high at the edge of the cul-de-sac, a bitter monument to arrogance. Neighbors whispered about what had happened, some out of fear, others out of outrage. A few secretly took pictures of the demolition crews, capturing evidence of the HOA's brazen actions. But the elderly woman, now displaced and humiliated, sat quietly with her son, still clutching a deed as though it might somehow undo the destruction. Her son, however, was not still. He spent that night combing through every statute, every HOA bylaw, and every piece of property law relevant to their case. Years of legal training had made him meticulous, and his personal connection to the matter sharpened his focus. The HOA hadn't just overstepped. They had obliterated nearly every legal protection a homeowner had. There had been no notice of eminent domain, no lawful condemnation process, no city approval, and no court order. Their so-called authority was nothing more than a facade of power backed by intimidation. By morning, he had crafted a legal strategy designed not just to punish but to utterly dismantle their defense. He filed suit for unlawful demolition, destruction of private property, emotional distress, and violation of state housing protections. He also sought punitive damages that, if granted, would devastate the HOA financially. It wasn't just about money, it was about accountability. When the HOA board members were served with court papers, their arrogance began to crack. Some scoffed, insisting their insurance would cover everything. Others, however, realized the magnitude of their mistake. They had assumed his mother was defenseless, a woman too old to fight back. They hadn't anticipated that her son would be a seasoned attorney, one who could present their misconduct before a judge with brutal clarity. In the days that followed, the community buzzed with tension. Some residents who had long resented the board quietly offered statements, recounting years of intimidation and overreach. Others, fearful of retaliation, stayed silent but privately cheered the lawsuit. The balance of power, once firmly in the HOA's hands, now teetered. The day of the first hearing arrived quickly. The board members walked into the courthouse with stiff expressions, clutching files and whispering among themselves. Their confidence was thin, forced, and laced with denial. They expected a standard dispute, a drawn-out case where they could stall and maneuver their way out of accountability. But what awaited them was a son standing firm, armed with undeniable evidence and the quiet fury of someone who had watched his mother's life shattered. The judge's eyes narrowed as he reviewed the photographs of the demolition, the deed proving ownership, and the lack of any lawful authorization. The courtroom felt heavy, the atmosphere charged with the weight of inevitable consequences. The HOA's attorney attempted to speak of community improvement and structural necessity, but each word rang hollow. The judge, unimpressed, demanded clarification on the absence of due process. Each answer only dug the board deeper, exposing their recklessness and disregard for the law. The cracks in their defense widened. What had once been a board united in arrogance was now a group of individuals realizing they were not only losing control, but possibly their own financial security. The son had built a case that could unravel their entire operation, and the judge seemed unwilling to grant them even a shred of sympathy. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado crumbling as they realized this wasn't going to end with a simple fine or an insurance payout. Something far larger loomed on the horizon. The final hearing arrived with the weight of inevitability. The courtroom was packed, not only with lawyers and board members, but with neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers who had followed the story from whispers to headlines. The sight of an elderly woman sitting quietly in the front row, her hands folded around the deed that should have protected her, stirred sympathy from even the most attached observers. The judge's entrance brought silence. Papers shuffled, and the air seemed to tighten as everyone waited for the verdict. The son stood calmly, his arguments already laid bare in previous hearings. He had painted a meticulous picture of greed, negligence, and abuse of power, leaving little room for the HOA to escape. Now, the judge's ruling would determine the cost of their arrogance. The HOA board's attorney tried one last desperate attempt to frame the demolition as a misunderstanding, but the evidence was overwhelming. The lack of permits, the absence of due process, and the blatant disregard for property rights all stood in sharp contrast to the board's flimsy narrative. The judge's questions cut like knives, leaving the attorney stammering and the board members visibly unraveling. When the ruling was finally delivered, it came like a hammer. The court found the HOA guilty of unlawful demolition, destruction of private property, and willful misconduct. The damages awarded were staggering, enough to bankrupt the HOA and force the individual board members into personal liability for their reckless decisions. The order demanded immediate compensation for rebuilding the home, punitive damages for emotional distress, and legal fees that would leave the board financially gutted. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by whispers that grew into a low hum of approval. Neighbors who had once been silent victims of the HOA's tyranny now felt a spark of vindication. Some even applauded quietly, though the judge quickly restored order. The elderly woman sat stunned, tears welling as the weight of justice sank in. Her son placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, not with triumph but with relief. He had not fought for glory but for her dignity, and at last the law had spoken. The board members, pale and shaken, shuffled out of the courtroom like defeated generals stripped of rank. Their empire of control had collapsed in a single verdict, leaving them vulnerable to lawsuits, community anger, and financial ruin. The power they had wielded so casually was gone, replaced by the shadow of their own mistakes. In the weeks that followed, the story spread far beyond the neighborhood. Local news outlets covered it, then regional, and finally national media picked it up as an example of unchecked HOA power brought to justice. The community, once divided by fear, rallied together. Neighbors began questioning rules, demanding reforms, and holding leaders accountable. The ruling had sparked not just justice for one woman, but a movement against abuse of authority. And in the middle of it all, the elderly woman quietly watched as her home was rebuilt, brick by brick. Each wall that rose was not just part of a house, but a symbol of resilience. She had lost much, but she had gained something far greater, proof that even against the strongest bullies, justice could still prevail. The board's downfall became a cautionary tale whispered in HOA meetings across the country. And for one family, it was a reminder that sometimes the only way to fight back against arrogance and cruelty was to stand firm, even when the odds seemed impossible. Do like, subscribe for more story.